All right. So we talked in our question today that after pollination, flowers become fruits usually. And so most of the things we think of as fruits, or even things we often consider vegetables, are actually fruits. And they all originate as flowers. What type of plant is this?
Corn.
Yeah, that's corn. Okay, you can see the ears of corn growing out of it. So that starts off as sort of a strange flower. It's kind of different. What you have, you've seen probably corn growing around here, obviously. And during the early stages, there's this sort of tassel at the top. Okay? And then each ear of corn has those silks coming out of it. Well, the tassel is where the pollen is produced from the corn plant. Okay? And then the silks are actually the female parts where they catch pollen. Okay, at the very end, each kernel of corn actually, probably never noticed because you just tear it off. But each kernel of corn in an ear has one silk attached to it that comes out through the top of the ear of corn. If you're like really carefully just peel off the leaves, you would see it look something like this, where every single kernel has one of those silks, because each of those is the style from the pistil of every single kernel of corn. And so if you were to take off a kernel of corn, this is what it would look like. You see the corn kernel, and then this is the very long style, and at the end would be the stigma, where it would catch a pollen grain. Now sometimes pollen doesn't reach every single stigma, and you probably noticed if you peel an ear of corn at the end often, there's like some that haven't developed into like kernels that you would eat. Those are the kernels that didn't get fertilized. They were not pollinated. Okay? So that's why they are sort of that undeveloped sort of brown texture. So here's just a time lapse, kind of neat, of some flowers developing into fruits. If you look at them slowly over time. Yep. So you see sort of the development there of the apple from the flower. Here's an actual, that's computer generated, here's the actual time lapse of a pear flower. So if you notice, you know, on fruits you eat an apple, a pear. So I have this pear. You know, there's like the stem part, there's that little part at the bottom. So what was this stem? That. What? This is where this was attached to a tree eventually.
Yeah.
And this part used to be what?
The flower.
The parts of the flowers. And then what is this actual fruit?
The pear. A seed.
What part of the flower?
The stigma.
Not the ovary.
Ovary, yeah.
And inside of this are what?
Ovules.
Which
Seeds.
became seeds. So yeah, after pollination, after a pollen grain fertilized these tiny little ovules in here, they became seeds. the ovary starts to thicken and ripen, okay, and it becomes the fruit of a plant. So that when you eat a piece of fruit, that's what you're eating, the ovary of a plant.
Ooh, that's,
Yeah. Some plants have interesting adaptations to attracting pollinators. Some have evolved to look like insects. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about mimicry. And what happens is, this is the flower itself, okay? And what happens is males see this flower and think it's a female, visit the flower, try to mate with it, and in the process, they get pollen on them from the flower that they can spread from flower to flower. So it's sort of an interesting adaptation for pollination. And so eventually those ovules develop into seeds. Okay. And a seed is sort of like an embryo of the plant. It will grow into a new plant. Okay? So seeds are the mature ovules. They usually form inside of the fruit. Most of the inside of an actual seed is filled up with a starchy substance. Okay? That's the food supply. It's called the cotyledon. And this is stored up nutrients that the tiny little embryo of a plant that's inside there will use when it first starts to grow. Because in the beginning stage, obviously it can't go through photosynthesis because it's in the ground, under the soil. So it needs some stored up energy to start its growth until it can pop above the ground and start to go through photosynthesis. So inside the seed, there's a tiny little plant, the embryo, and then there's the food supply, the cotyledon. It's all covered up by sort of a coat that helps protect it. It's called the seed coat. And so when we eat, beans, for example, you're eating the seeds of a plant. They're starchy and they have that starch in them because you're eating that cotyledon. Seeds are used to make flour. Wheat seeds are used to make flour. Do you know the difference between white flour and whole wheat flour? Or white bread and whole wheat bread? What's the difference in how it tastes or in its texture?
the white is soft.
Yeah.
The grains like milk longer?
Not so much longer, but Alex?
Isn't it like more, isn't the bread like, the wheat is like all natural, isn't it like more?
Sort of. To make whole wheat flour, you would take a whole seed and grind it all up. The seed coat, okay, the embryo, the cotyledon. To make white flour or white bread, they take off the seed coat, they take out this, and they just grind up the starchy inside. Okay, so it has less of that seed coat, or none of that seed coat in there. And that seed coat gives it sort of a different sort of texture, more of a grainy, because it's a thick sort of outer layer that's for protection. So those seeds that are produced inside the fruit, like we talked about in our question today, need to be dispersed. It's best if they end up somewhere away from the parent plant. That happens in lots of different ways. Some plants, wind carries those seeds. Like, what is this? That's a mature dandelion. You know, you might find it in your yard and you blow on it. Parents might be mad at you because what are you actually doing?
Growing more.
You're dispersing the seeds of that dandelion throughout the rest of your lawn to start to grow. This is what type of tree that this comes from?
It's like the helicopter.
Yeah, it's like a helicopter. It comes from, maple trees. Those little helicopters they spin.
Yes.
Well, the reason they spin like that, the adaptation is that when they fall from the tree, they spin. The air can then take them somewhere else, far away, rather than just all landing at the base of the tree. Some seeds, a coconut is a seed. Some seeds actually float in the water and eventually wash up somewhere in a beach and could start to grow in a new area. Animals disperse lots of seeds. This is one of the most common means of seed dispersal. because when the fruit forms around the seed, okay, usually it's enriched with nutrients, with sugars and so forth. And so animals like to eat fruits. It's a common food source. And animals eat the fruit and digest these seeds, and eventually those seeds come out when the animal goes to the bathroom. But it's in a different place. So they disperse those seeds to another area. Some fruits have burrs on them, like a burdocks. Ever got these in your clothes or in your hair? Yeah, they're a seed dispersal mechanism. They get attached to the fur of animals, which move around. Eventually they fall off, and now those seeds can grow in a new area. Also, nuts. Squirrels, for example, take nuts, which is a fruit with a seed inside. They bury them, store them up for the winter, for the next spring. But sometimes they don't dig them all up, and then they can start to grow in the ground. These are some neat seeds you see growing around here. Okay, it's called jewelweed. Okay, and these actually burst open when they're mature. You could touch them, and they burst open, and they sort of throw their seeds around. Like I don't know if you can see it that well in this video. Touch this, it kind of explodes, and the seeds go flying. And this is what it looks like when it's mature. And these you could find around here. It's kind of cool. They grow in sort of wet areas. They're almost like spring-loaded to all right, we'll do our flower lab tomorrow. All right. So we talked a lot yesterday about flowers and pollination. So I think you now understand how flowers get pollinated. So this is a plant that you've seen a lot of around here. What is it? Corn plant. However, you know, we see corn all the time around here driving. And we see it throughout its various stages as it grows and gets larger and so forth. But have you ever really seen flowers on a corn plant? They don't have very large, conspicuous flowers. Okay? They're generally wind pollinated, which means they don't have very large, showy flowers. They're much smaller. Okay? When you look at a mature corn plant, you know, you have the ears of corn that grow sort of in the leaves. You know this thing, you've seen this, the like tassel at the top? Okay. Well, the flowers, there's male and female flowers. The tassel at the very top, which matures, that's actually the male parts of the flower. That's where the pollen is produced. Those are the anthers. And what might tell you that this is wind pollinated? Yeah? Yeah, they're long, they're exposed to the air, so as the wind blows, it's going to blow some of that pollen away. The female parts, the female flowers, are down here where the ears of corn will develop. And you know what the silk of a corn stalk is, right? A cob that you have to peel off if you're going to have corn. Actually, what that silk is, those are the styles of the female parts of the flower. Every single corn kernel has one of those silks attached to it. And you can sort of see it here in this picture. If you were to carefully peel off the leaves of the corn and have the silk still attached, you would be able to follow and see that every single piece of silk attaches to one kernel of corn. Okay? And so pollen lands on the ends of those silks where the stigma is. Pollen grain fertilizes one of the flowers, and it then develops into a mature corn kernel. Hold on one second. So you see here, this is one of the kernels of corn with the style still attached to it. So again, this is the mature ovary down here, this is the style, the very end is the stigma which would catch the pollen. If you ever helped your parents like shuck corn to make for dinner or something, you also might notice like the end of the corn often, it doesn't have mature kernels. Have you noticed that? You might like break this end off and throw it away because there's nothing to eat there. Those are kernels that did not get pollinated. If pollination doesn't happen, the fruit doesn't develop. Like I said, if your tomato flowers never got pollinated, they wouldn't grow into tomatoes. Same thing, some of the corn kernels don't get pollinated and they don't develop. So the purpose of the flower being pollinated is to fertilize those ovules. Okay? Once that has happened, then the fruit can start to form. So what is this?
Pear.
Yes. One day, sometime in the past, this pear was what? What did it start as? It was it was a seed. It grew to a plant. The plant flowered, and this was once a flower. Okay. It got pollinated. What was this? Yeah, this is where it was like attached to the tree. Pears grow on trees. Okay, this is a pear growing, and it was attached to a tree there. And this is where, what is this like little prickly part at the end of a fruit? Like you see it in the apple, you see it in the pear. Yeah, that's where like the flower, the parts of the flower, they're all dried up now because it's after the fruit's developed, but that's where the flower was. That's like what's left over of the petals. This is like a time-lapse video showing a little bit of that. I'll just show you this quickly. This is a pear. And here, again, you see the process. Here you can still sort of see the flower parts that are still there as the rest of the pear was maturing around it. This is time lapse. So it's filmed, over a period of time. You can see a few different things. You see the flowers. These are all pear flowers. You can see the pistil in the middle. What are all these? Stamens. Yep. It's like I'm frozen. Oh, sorry.
It's going.
Yep. So there you got the pears, the immature pear fruit starting to form. As the fruit gets bigger, the stamens start to dry up. They're obviously no longer needed anymore. And you're left with a pear. Now, some plants have taken some evolutionary pathways that are kind of interesting. Some plants, their flowers have developed to mimic and look like actually insects. And they even produce compounds that make them smell like insects. This is a flower, okay, that's meant to attract insects to it. And see, it sort of looks like an insect. What happens is male insects will think that's a female and try to mate with it, even though it's just a flower. And in the process, they get pollen on them, and they help spread that pollen to other flowers. So that's one interesting adaptation some plants have to pollination. So after pollination, after the ovules have been fertilized by a sperm cell that was carried in the pollen grain, then the seed can start to form. What really is a seed? What's that? Well, it's the ovule that's fertilized, but what exactly is it?
Something that produces a plant.
Yeah, it's basically a baby plant. It's a plant embryo. That's what a seed is. Inside of a seed, you have a couple parts. It's covered in a coat around the outside. Then you have sort of a starchy part of the seed. And then you also have a tiny little plant inside there, the plant embryo. Okay? So the seed is the matured ovule after fertilization. And it usually forms inside of a fruit. This large area here is called the cotyledon. It's where energy is stored. And there's also the embryo, the actual plant that will grow. So this cotyledon has starch-like materials. And so as the seed is starting to grow and it's underground, obviously it doesn't have any leaves yet that are exposed. It can't go through photosynthesis. So to get the energy to begin growing, it gets it from this stored up cotyledon, this energy stored in the cotyledon. We eat this energy stored in the cotyledon as well. If you have beans, those beans are like starchy. That's all that stored up energy. Or nuts, right? That's that stored up energy. Wheat, flour, okay, comes from that cotyledon. The outside, it's all sort of protected in this seed coat. And seeds can stay dormant for a long time and then begin to grow once conditions are right. We'll talk about that later on. So where does flour come from? Like white flour that's used to make bread or something?
Grains.
Yeah, one specific grain.
Wheat.
usually. Wheat flour is what we usually use. There's other types of flour, but yeah, wheat flour. What are like two main categories of bread or flour that you might find at the store? Rihanna?
Like white bread.
White flour or,
Whole wheat.
well, that's one, whole wheat. You might get white bread or whole wheat bread. White pasta or whole wheat pasta. So, you know what the difference is between it? They both come from wheat, grinding up the seeds of a wheat plant. Do you know what the difference is then between white flour and whole wheat flour?
One tastes good.
They both taste good. Some people prefer whole wheat. Alexandra? Yeah, in a specific way. Whole, what do you think? Whole wheat. If you think about the word, Bailey?
Like it's not.
Yeah, sort of. To make whole wheat flour, they just grind up the whole wheat seed. It includes the seed coat, includes the embryo in there, and the starchy part. And so whole wheat flour, whole wheat bread has sort of a stronger texture, more to it. White flour, they take off the seed coat and the wheat germ, the baby embryo, and just grind up the starchy stuff in between. So it doesn't have those other parts to it. All right. So how do these seeds disperse? Well, there's several ways. You guys told me when we went over our homework some of them. One way is through wind. Okay? So dispersal means to spread seeds to other areas. And wind is an important one. Here's a couple seeds that are dispersed by the wind. What is this?
Dandelion.
Dandelion. That's a mature dandelion. What do they start off as?
The yellow flower.
Yellow flowers. Once they're pollinated, they develop into this phase. When you blow on one of those, what goes flying around? Tiny little seeds that are attached to a tiny little white filament that helps carry it through the air. That's why those are there, to help it coast through the air, I guess you could say. So your parents probably don't like it when you do that. You blow on those little dandelion things, because you're spreading dandelion seeds throughout your lawn.
Are dandelions weeds?
Yeah. What about these? What kind of tree do these come from?
Oh, I have one of those. Maple?
Those are maple seeds from a maple tree. So you know, I'm sure you pick them up after they're dry and throw in the air and they spin around. That's an adaptation. How is that helpful to the maple trees? Yeah.
Can like fly farther away.
Yeah, as they're slowly coming down, if the wind picks up, it can carry them quite a distance away, so it disperses those seeds. What is this? Nope. What type? It's something you may have eaten before. It's a coconut.
That's a coconut?
Coconuts are adapted so that a coconut is a seed, a large seed. They're adapted to fall into the water. They float because they're hollow. They float along, eventually wash up somewhere, and start to grow again. Again, it's a means of seed dispersal.
Wait, coconuts float in the water?
Yeah, they float in the water.
Oh, that way? Oh, that one. Why would it germinate?
Then it doesn't germinate and grow. Another one of the most common ways, the one we're familiar with, are animal dispersal. So lots of times animals help to disperse seeds. One way is through fruits. Okay? So when animals eat fruits and consume them, they eat them because the fruit has yummy stuff on the outside that's nutritious. That's an adaptation to make it more likely. Usually plants don't want animals to eat them. But plants do want animals to eat their fruits because they help to disperse the seeds. Because the animal consumes the fruit, consumes the seeds, goes somewhere else after it's digested, and then releases those seeds when it goes to the bathroom. And the animal releases feces in that, they're seeds. Some types of seeds have burrs attached to them, which cling to the fur of animals and get transported from place to place. Eventually those burrs fall off and then they start to grow somewhere else.
I hate it when you get those oranges.
Yeah.
I did get them all.
Nuts, for example. Some animals will bury the seeds of certain trees, saving them for future time when they don't have as much food, but they forget about some of them. Can't find them, and then they can grow into another plant. One cool way, and you can find these around here in wet areas, this is sometimes called a touch-me-not or jewelry. Yeah, and what happens is once they're pollinated, the flowers mature into this sort of closed up pod. And what happens is, once it's mature, if you touch it, if the wind blows on it, if an animal brushes against it, it's spring-loaded, and it basically explodes and sends the seeds flying outward. Here, you can see this a little bit. It's kind of hard to see because it happens so quickly, but if you ever find these, you see them sometimes hiking on the side of a trail. If they're mature and they're like plump, you can just go and press them and they kind of cool. No. So that's just kind of explodes.
So the whole point of that plant is to spread your seeds.
The purpose of that exploding pod is to spread the seeds away from the parent plant. So just seed dispersal, animals is kind of interesting. The purpose of fruits is to attract animals to help disperse seeds. Often fruits are brightly colored to attract animals. Animals eat those fruits, consume the seeds, and then those seeds are ejected somewhere else where they can then grow into a new seed. That's bear poop.
Ew.
Oh my gosh. How are there so many seeds?
What is it?
How are there so many seeds?
Because they ate a lot of berries. Okay? That's fox poop.
Why do we have to see these? Why are they taking pictures?
That's raccoon poop. But all of them contain seeds.
Looks like
These animals are helping the seeds, the plants that they ate, disperse. All right.
Wait, strawberries are a fruit?
What?
Strawberries are a fruit?
Strawberries are fruit.
It says, why strawberries aren't berries?
Like tomatoes are fruits.
Wait, strawberries aren't berries?
No, not technically.
Why are berries not
We'll watch this video at some point.